Before we begin this incredible tale, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoy epic Viking stories, subscribe to the channel for more Norse mythology adventures, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now let's dive into our story. The morning mist clung to the wooden palisades of Nordheim like the breath of sleeping giants, and young Torvald pressed his small hands against the cold stone walls of the great hall's foundation. At merely 8 winters old, he had learned to make himself invisible, a skill that kept him fed and alive in a village that had little patience for orphaned mouths. The settlement of Nordheim stretched along the rocky coastline where the North Sea crashed against towering cliffs, its longhouses built from massive oak timbers that had weathered countless storms. Smoke rose from morning cooking fires, carrying the scent of fish stew and barley bread through the crisp autumn air. The villagers moved about their daily tasks with practiced efficiency, fishermen mending nets by the harbour, blacksmiths stoking their forges, and women weaving wool into the thick cloaks that would see them through another harsh winter. Torvald had no memory of his parents. They had perished in a fever that swept through the village when he was barely 3 summers old. Since then, he had survived on the reluctant charity of the villagers, sleeping in the corner of the grain storage house and earning his meager meals by running errands, cleaning fish, and performing whatever small tasks the adults deemed suitable for his size. His appearance marked him as different from the typical Nordic children. Where most village youth had the golden hair and blue eyes common to their people, Torvald's hair was dark as a raven's wing, and his eyes held an unusual green hue that seemed to shift like sea foam in changing light. Some of the older women whispered that he carried the blood of the forest dwellers from the far eastern lands, though none could say how such heritage had found its way to their coastal settlement. The boy had learned to read the moods of the village like a sailor reads the sky for storms. When the fishing was poor, tempers grew short, and his presence became even less welcome. When raiders threatened the coast, the adults had no time for a small orphan's needs. But Torvald had also learned that his keen eyes and quick feet made him useful. He could slip through spaces too narrow for adults, climb to places too high for the elderly, and most importantly, he could observe without being noticed. It was this last skill that had led him to discover the village's greatest secret. Beyond the main settlement, past the burial grounds where ancient stone markers stood sentinel over the honored dead, rose a hill crowned with a structure unlike any other in Nordheim. The locals called it the Old Prison, a circular stone tower built by their ancestors from massive blocks of granite that seemed to drink in the sunlight rather than reflect it. Iron bars thick as a man's arm blocked its single window, and heavy chains secured a door that no one in living memory had seen opened. The official story, told to children to keep them away from the forbidden place, was that the tower held the remains of ancient enemies, criminals and oath-breakers from the old days who had been locked away and forgotten. But Torvald had crept close enough on several occasions to hear something that contradicted this tale, the sound of breathing, deep and rhythmic, accompanied by an occasional scrape of movement across stone. Whatever lived within the old prison was very much alive. The villagers' behavior around the tower only deepened the mystery. Once each week, always at dawn when few were about, the village chief Halvard would make a solemn procession to the structure. He carried with him a large wooden bucket that steamed in the cool morning air, filled with what Torvald assumed was food scraps and water. The chief would approach the tower with obvious reluctance, slide the bucket through a specially designed opening at the base of the door, and retreat quickly without lingering to see if the offering was accepted. More curious still were the stories the village elders told around the fire on long winter nights. They spoke in hushed tones of a guardian curse that protected Nordheim, a power so terrible that even mentioning it directly was considered unlucky. When children asked for details, they were quickly hushed and sent to bed. but Torvin, pressed small and silent against the shadows at the edge of the firelight, had pieced together fragments of a larger tale. Long ago, before any living villager had been born, a great threat had come to their land. The stories varied in their details. Sometimes it was a horde of savage raiders, other times a terrible plague, occasionally a supernatural winter that threatened to freeze the very sea. But in each version, the people of Nordheim had made a desperate bargain to survive. They had bound something powerful but dangerous to protect their village, imprisoning it in the tower where it could guard them without threatening their daily lives. The price of this protection was eternal vigilance and regular offerings. The weekly tribute that Chief Halvard continued to this day, following traditions passed down through generations of leaders who had inherited the responsibility without fully understanding its origins. Torvin's fascination with the tower had grown over the years from simple curiosity to something approaching obsession. He had mapped every approach to the structure, noted the patterns of the chief's visits, and even attempted to peer through the barred window during the brightest parts of summer days. All he had managed to glimpse were shapes moving in the darkness within, something large enough to cast shadows, but too obscured by the tower's gloom to identify clearly. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the oak leaves in shades of gold and crimson, Torvin found his attention drawn once again to the Forbidden Tower. Chief Halvard had made his weekly journey at dawn as usual, but something had been different about his demeanor. The normally stoic leader had approached the tower with even greater reluctance than usual, and Torvin had noticed the man's hands trembling as he set down the offering bucket. More troubling still, the bucket had remained untouched for hours after the chief's departure. In all of Torvin's careful observations, the weekly tribute had always disappeared within moments of being delivered, snatched through the opening by something swift and unseen. Today, the container sat in the morning sunlight, its contents growing cold and untouched. As the day progressed and the village went about its business, Torvin noticed other subtle signs that something was amiss. The fishing boats that had departed before dawn returned early with meager catches, their crews speaking in worried whispers about strange movements they had seen on the distant horizon. The village's few horses seemed skittish, refusing to graze in the fields closest to the old prison. Even the ravens that normally flocked to the settlement for scraps had taken wing and disappeared inland, leaving an unusual quiet in their absence. By midday, Torvin's worry had transformed into determination. Whatever dwelt within the tower was clearly in distress, and the village's supernatural protection might be failing just when they needed it most. The boy had no family to forbid his actions, no one who would miss him if he failed to return from a dangerous venture. If the ancient guardian was weakening or dying, perhaps a small orphan might succeed where the village's warriors feared to tread. The decision crystallized in his mind, like ice forming on still water, clear, solid, and impossible to ignore. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western sea, Torvin gathered what few possessions he could call his own: a small eating knife with a bone handle, a coil of fishing line, and most precious of all, a small silver pendant that had belonged to his mother. The pendant was his only inheritance, shaped like a tree with spreading branches and worn smooth by years of handling. He also gathered food, not for himself, but for whatever waited in the tower. From the kitchen scraps behind the great hall, he collected the choicest pieces: fresh fish, still pink with life, warm bread that had been baked that morning, and a small pot of honey that he had seen the cooks use to sweeten the chief's meals. If the creature in the tower was refusing the village's usual offerings, perhaps it craved something fresher, prepared with care rather than fear. As the shadows lengthened and the village prepared for its evening meal, Torvin made his way through the settlement's winding paths toward the burial grounds and the hill beyond. His small feet made no sound on the worn stone steps that led past the ancient graves, and his dark clothing helped him blend with the deepening shadows of twilight. The old prison loomed before him, its circular walls rising into the darkening sky like a monument to forgotten gods. Up close, the structure was even more imposing than it appeared from a distance. The stone blocks were fitted together with such precision that not even a blade of grass could grow between them, and the metal reinforcements showed no signs of rust, despite what must have been centuries of exposure to the coastal weather. The untouched offering bucket sat where Chief Halvard had left it, its contents now cold and congealing in the evening air. Torven approached it carefully, noting that whatever lived within the tower had made no attempt to retrieve the food. This close to the structure, he could hear the sounds of life within more clearly. Not just breathing, but occasional movements that suggested something large shifting position, and what might have been soft sounds of distress. Setting his own small offering of fresh food beside the abandoned bucket, Torven steeled himself for what he was about to do. The opening at the base of the door was just large enough for him to push his arm through, designed to allow food to be passed inside while maintaining the security of the prison. But Torven had observed that the hole was slightly larger than necessary for its intended purpose, perhaps large enough for someone his size to squeeze through entirely. The boy had no plan beyond offering help to whatever creature lived within the tower. His young mind could not fully grasp the implications of his actions, nor the ancient forces he was about to encounter. All he knew was that something was in pain, that the village's traditional methods of dealing with the situation were proving inadequate, and that he possessed the unique combination of size, courage, and desperation necessary to attempt what no adult would dare. Taking a deep breath of the cool evening air, Torven began to work his small body through the opening at the base of the tower door. The stone was cold against his skin, and the passage was tight enough that he had to exhale completely to fit through. For a moment he wondered if he would become stuck, trapped half in and half out of the prison, like some sort of living cork. But then his shoulders cleared the opening, and he tumbled forward into the darkness within. The interior of the old prison was nothing like what Torven had imagined. Instead of the dank, cramped cell he had expected, he found himself in a circular chamber that rose high into shadows above his head. Pale light filtered down from the barred window, creating a column of illumination that revealed carved symbols covering every surface of the stone walls. The symbols were unlike any writing Torven had seen, flowing curves and angular lines that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering light. But it was the chamber's occupant that stole all of Torven's attention and left him frozen in wonder and terror. Coiled in the center of the circular room was a dragon, unlike any creature from the stories told around the village fires. Its scales shimmered with colors that seemed to exist beyond the normal spectrum. Deep purples that shifted to emerald green, gold that flowed like honey into silver, bright as starlight. The creature was massive, easily 30 feet from nose to tail, yet its presence filled the space with a grace that spoke of intelligence and ancient wisdom rather than mere bestial power. Heavy chains bound the dragon's limbs to iron rings set deep into the chamber walls. The metal links were as thick as Torven's waist, forged from some black alloy that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Where the chains touched the dragon's scales, the magnificent colors had faded to dull gray, and Torven could see worn patches where centuries of confinement had rubbed the creature's hide raw. The dragon's great head turned toward him as he tumbled through the entrance, and Torven found himself staring into eyes that held depths of sadness and wisdom that seemed older than the stones of the earth itself. They were violet in color, shot through with veins of silver that pulsed like captured lightning. For a long moment, neither creature moved, the small human child and the ancient dragon regarding each other across a space that had been designed to keep them forever apart. When the dragon finally spoke, its voice was like distant thunder rolling across summer mountains, deep and resonant with harmonics that seemed to vibrate in Torven's very bones. "Little one," the dragon said, its words carrying accents of languages long forgotten, You should not be here. The bindings that hold me are old and strong, but they cannot distinguish between willing sacrifice and innocent accident. If you have come seeking death, you will find it. If you have come seeking treasure, you will find only disappointment. What is it you truly seek in this forgotten place? Torvin's throat felt dry as winter kindling, but he managed to find his voice. You didn't eat, he said simply. The chief brought food, but you didn't eat it. You sound hurt. The dragon's massive head tilted slightly, and something that might have been surprise flickered across its ancient features. You came here because I refused a meal? Child, do you understand where you are? What I am? You're the guardian, Torvin replied, his confidence growing as he spoke. The village stories say you protect us from enemies, but you're trapped here. The chains, he gestured toward the black metal bonds, they hurt you. A sound like distant laughter rumbled from the dragon's chest, though there was no humor in it. Guardian, yes. Protected, debatable. These chains have held me for 7 centuries, little one. They were forged by your ancestors when they summoned me from the realm beyond the northern lights. I came willingly then, answering their desperate call for aid against enemies that would have swept their settlement from the face of the earth like leaves before a storm. The dragon shifted slightly, and Torvin could see how the movement caused the creature obvious pain. The chains had worn grooves in the stone floor where centuries of small movements had ground metal against rock. I fulfilled my part of the bargain, the dragon continued. I drove back the raiders who would have burned your village and taken your people as thralls. I turned aside the plague ships that would have brought death to every living thing on this coast. I called down the storms that scattered enemy fleets and raised the fogs that hid your fishermen from hostile eyes. For 700 years I have been the shield between Nordheim and destruction. But they chained you, Torvin said, his young voice heavy with the injustice of it. Why didn't they set you free once the danger was gone? The dragon's great eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened again, they seemed to hold all the weariness of centuries. Because they were afraid, little one. They had called something into their world that was beyond their understanding, and once the immediate threat was gone, they feared what I might do if released. So they chose to keep their guardian chained, fed just enough to maintain my strength for protection, but never trusted enough to be free. Torvin approached the dragon slowly, his small hands reaching toward the nearest chain. The metal was cold to the touch and seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy that made his fingers tingle unpleasantly. Can't you break free? You're so strong. The chains were forged with more than mere iron, the dragon explained. They are bound with the collected will of your people, their fear, their need, their desperation, all woven into the metal itself. As long as the village exists and remembers the old compact, the bonds cannot be broken by strength alone. The boy studied the dragon's magnificent features, noting the way the creature's breathing seemed labored and the dullness that had crept into the edges of its scales. You're dying, he said, with the stark honesty that only children possess. Not dying, the dragon corrected gently, but fading. Each year, the old compact grows weaker as the village forgets why I was summoned. The new generations know only that they must maintain a prisoner, not that they once welcomed an ally. The food they bring tastes of fear and obligation rather than gratitude. Such nourishment sustains the body, but starves the spirit. Torvin reached into his small bundle and pulled out the fresh fish he had brought. Unlike the cold offerings that sat abandoned outside, his gift was still warm from the afternoon sun, prepared with care and brought in hope rather than duty. He held it out toward the dragon, his small hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. I brought this for you, he said simply, not because anyone told me to, but because no one should have to be alone and hungry. The dragon stared at the offered food for a long moment, then lowered its great head until it was level with the boy. When it spoke again, its voice had changed. The thunder was still there, but now it carried harmonics of something that might have been hope. You would feed me willingly, with no fear, no obligation, no thought of what you might gain. Yes, Torvin replied without hesitation. "You protected my village. You protected me, even though I never knew it. It's the least I can do." The dragon accepted the fish with infinite gentleness, its massive jaws careful not to come too close to the boy's small hands. As it ate, a transformation began to occur. The dull patches on its scales began to brighten, and the oppressive atmosphere of the chamber seemed to lighten slightly. "Your gift is more precious than you know, young one," the dragon said after finishing the meal. "It is the first food offered to me in friendship, rather than fear, in over 2 centuries. Tell me, what is your name?" "Torvin," the boy replied. I'm nobody important, just an orphan." The dragon's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time since the conversation began, there was something that might have been calculation in its ancient gaze. "Torvin, a good name. From the old tongue, it means thunder's child. And you say you are an orphan? No family, no one to whom you owe allegiance?" "No one," Torvin confirmed, though he wondered why the dragon seemed interested in this fact. "Then perhaps," the dragon said slowly, "the old prophecies were not as forgotten as I believed. Tell me, child, do you know the story of how your people first came to this land?" Torvin shook his head. The village histories he had heard always began with the settlement already established, as if Nordheim had simply appeared fully formed on the coastal cliffs. "Long ago, before your ancestors built their first longhouse, this coast was ruled by a different people, fair folk who lived in harmony with the natural world and the creatures of legend. They made compacts not through force or fear, but through understanding and mutual benefit. When the first Nordic settlers arrived, fleeing from wars and disasters in their homeland, they were welcomed and taught the old ways of cooperation with the supernatural world." The dragon paused, its great head turning toward the carved symbols on the chamber walls. "Those symbols tell a different version of my summoning than the one your people remember. They speak of a willing alliance, not a desperate binding. They tell of a compact that was meant to evolve and grow, not to become a prison of perpetual servitude." "What do they say?" Torvin asked, though he suspected he already knew where this conversation was leading. "They speak of a test," the dragon replied. "A time when someone would come to this chamber not as a keeper bringing tribute to a prisoner, but as a friend offering aid to an ally. Someone with no ties to the old fears and prejudices. Someone pure of heart who could see past the chains to the truth beneath." The dragon's violet eyes fixed on Torvin with an intensity that seemed to look straight through to his soul. "They say that when such a person came, the ancient compact could be renewed, not as a binding between captor and prisoner, but as a true partnership between guardian and protected." Torvin felt a strange, tingling sensation, as if the very air around him was charged with potential energy. "The chains, are you saying they're not really necessary anymore?" "I am saying," the dragon replied carefully, "that they never were necessary, in the truest sense. I have remained here by choice as much as by compulsion, honoring the old agreement even as it was twisted into something I never intended. But you, young Torvin, have shown me something I had almost forgotten, that not all humans see dragons as monsters to be feared or tools to be used." The boy looked around the circular chamber, taking in the carved prophecies and the evidence of centuries of imprisonment. "If I helped you get free, what would happen to the village? Would you still protect it?" The dragon was quiet for a long moment, and when it spoke, its voice carried the weight of absolute sincerity. "A dragon's word, freely given, is stronger than any chain forged by fear. If you were to release me, not as an act of rebellion against your people, but as an act of faith in what we could become together, I would guard Nordheim and all who dwell within it until the end of days." But the others won't understand," Torvin said, thinking of Chief Halvard's fearful weekly visits. "They'll think I've doomed them all." "Perhaps," the dragon agreed, "but sometimes, little Thunderchild, the greatest acts of courage appear to be the greatest acts of foolishness. The choice is yours to make, and I will honor whatever decision you reach." Torvin approached the nearest chain anchor, studying the way the metal was set into the stone. The iron ring was massive, clearly designed to hold against any conceivable force, but as he examined it more closely, he noticed something the dragon had not mentioned. The carved symbols surrounding each anchor point were not binding runes, as he had assumed. They were keys. "You could have freed yourself," he said, sudden understanding flooding through him. "These aren't locks, they're tests. You've been waiting for someone who would choose to trust you." The dragon's expression confirmed his realization. 700 years, it said quietly. 700 years of waiting for someone to see past the fear to the truth. The physical chains could be broken by any child with the knowledge to read the ancient script. But the real chains, the ones forged of mistrust and prejudice, those could only be dissolved by an act of genuine faith. Torvald traced the symbols with his finger, and they seemed to pulse with inner light at his touch. The ancient words were in a language he had never learned, but somehow their meaning flowed into his mind as clearly as if they had been written in his native tongue. They spoke of freedom and trust, of partnerships between the earthbound and the skyborn, of guardians who served not from compulsion, but from love. As the boy spoke the words aloud, his young voice growing stronger with each syllable, the black chains began to glow with heat. The metal links expanded and contracted in rhythm with his words, and hairline cracks appeared along their length. When Torvald finished the ancient formula, the chains shattered like glass struck by lightning, filling the chamber with the sound of ringing metal and the whisper of dispersing magic. The dragon rose to its full height for the first time in 7 centuries, its magnificent head nearly touching the chamber's domed ceiling. The creature's scales blazed with renewed color, and its eyes shone like captured stars. When it spread its wings that had been pinned against its sides by the chains, they filled the circular space with their span, each membrane glowing translucent in the evening light that filtered down from above. "Free," the dragon whispered, and the words seemed to carry on winds that had not blown in the chamber for generations. Truly free, and by the choice of one who asked for nothing in return. Outside the tower, Torvald could hear the sounds of alarm rising from the village, shouts of fear and confusion, as the people of Nordheim realized that something fundamental had changed in their world. The dragon heard them too, and its expression grew thoughtful. "They will be afraid," it said. "They will think their doom has come at last. How shall we show them otherwise?" Before Torvald could answer, a new sound reached their ears, the harsh blare of warning horns sounding from the harbor. Through the chamber's high window came the flicker of firelight reflected off the water, and the boy realized with growing horror that the village's fears were about to be tested in the most immediate way possible. Raiders had come to Nordheim, drawn perhaps by the supernatural disturbance of the dragon's release, or simply by the cruel coincidence that marked the darkest moments in human history. Their longships were already entering the harbor, and by the light of their torches, Torvald could see armed figures leaping onto the docks with weapons raised and battle cries echoing across the water. The dragon heard the sounds of approaching battle and felt the terror radiating from the village it had guarded for so long. When it looked down at Torvald, its ancient eyes blazed with purpose and determination. "It seems, young Thunderchild, that we will have our first chance to show your people what true partnership can accomplish. Are you ready to stand with me as an ally rather than a keeper?" Torvald felt fear coursing through his small body, but beneath it was something stronger, a sense of rightness, as if all the events of his young life had been leading to this moment. "What do you need me to do?" The dragon smiled, an expression that transformed its fearsome features into something almost gentle. "Trust me, as I have learned to trust you, and hold tight. We have a village to save." Years later, when the skalds sang songs around the fires of Nordheim, and the children begged for stories of the old days, they would speak of the night when everything changed. They told of how young Torvald, the orphan boy with eyes like sea foam, rode into battle on the back of the great dragon that had been their secret guardian for centuries. They sang of how the raiders' ships burned on the harbor waters, not destroyed by dragonfire but by their own torches, dropped in terror when they saw the magnificent creature rise from the village like a living constellation against the night sky. They spoke of how the dragon's roar alone was enough to turn the enemy fleet away, sending them fleeing into the dark waters with tales that would keep other raiders away from Nordheim's shores for generations to come. But most of all, they remembered the moment when the dragon landed gently in the village square, lowered its great head, and allowed the boy to slide down from its neck to stand before the assembled people of Nordheim. In that moment, Chief Halvard and all the villagers saw not a monster and its victim, but partners who had chosen to trust each other completely. The old prison still stands on its hill overlooking the village, but now its doors are open and its walls are covered with new carvings, symbols of friendship and alliance rather than binding and fear. The dragon comes and goes as it pleases, sometimes soaring high over the coastal waters to keep watch for threats, sometimes resting in the tower that has become a home rather than a prison. And Torvin? He grew to become the village's first dragon speaker, a new kind of leader who bridged the worlds of human and legend. Under his guidance, Nordheim prospered as never before, protected not by fear and chains, but by the unbreakable bonds of freely given friendship. The weekly offerings to the tower continued, but they changed in nature, no longer tribute paid to appease a dangerous prisoner, but gifts shared between friends. And sometimes, when the mood struck them both, the dragon and its human partner could be seen flying together over the northern seas, free as the wind and bound by something far stronger than any chain ever forged. For in the end, the ancient prophecy had proven true. The greatest magic was not in the binding of power, but in the willing alliance of different souls united in common cause. And that magic, once freely given, would endure as long as there were those brave enough to choose trust over fear, friendship over dominance, and love over power. The dragon still guards Nordheim to this day, they say. And somewhere among the village children there may be another orphan with unusual eyes, waiting for their moment to discover that the greatest adventures begin not with conquest, but with a simple act of kindness offered to someone the world has forgotten. Would you like me to expand on any particular aspects of this story or adjust the tone for your specific audience? I can also help develop additional episodes in this series if you'd like to continue the adventures of Torven and his dragon partner.